Somewhere along the Nile, in the shadow of sandstone cliffs that have stood for 5,000 years, lived a people who never belonged. Not to Egypt, not to Africa as we understand it. Not to any civilization that left recognizable traces in the archaeological record. They built pyramids taller than the Pharaohs. They conquered Egypt when Egypt was at its peak. They ruled from the throne of the world's first superpower. Yet every explanation historians offered for who they really were, every theory about where they came from, collapsed under scrutiny. I first encountered the Nubians while chasing a lead about lost Egyptian gold mines. What started as a footnote turned into 3 weeks of dead ends, strange measurements, and skeletal remains that didn't match anything in the database. The DNA evidence that finally answered the question didn't clarify anything. It made the contradiction sharper, more insistent, more impossible to ignore. Start with the simplest version of their paradox. Every great Nile civilization we know, Egyptian, Kushite, Meroitic, followed a predictable pattern. They emerged from the same river valley soil, absorbed the same agricultural revolution, worshipped variations of the same gods, built with the same sandstone. Their material culture blended into a continuum you could trace from Memphis to Meru without breaking stride. Every civilization except one. The classic Nubians, the ones who ruled Egypt as the 25th dynasty, don't fit that continuum. Their pyramids point south, not north. Their gods carry names no Egyptologist recognizes from the standard pantheon. Their burial practices mix northern sophistication with something primal, something older. Their skeletons measure taller, broader, with cranial features that sit outside both Egyptian and sub-Saharan norms. That is not a minor variation. That is an entire civilization that appears to have walked in from somewhere else. The contradiction deepens when you look at their material record. Napata, their original capital, sits 1,000 kilometers south of Thebes, yet its temple architecture copies Luxor down to the column capitals while incorporating motifs no Egyptian dynast ever used. Meroitic script, their written language, defies every decoding attempt, despite looking deceptively similar to hieroglyphs. Their ironworking predates any European technology by centuries, using a lost smelting process we still can't fully replicate. I spent 2 days once staring at photographs of the Meroitic script, trying to force patterns that weren't there. 10 minutes in, I realized I wasn't reading incorrectly. The language simply didn't yield. Nothing about it reminded me of anything I already knew. That frustrating dead end turned out to be the first real clue. A people who resist explanation for a reason, and that reason runs much deeper than dead languages or unreadable inscriptions. The linguistic and architectural mysteries were strange enough. Then the osteologists got involved, and the real argument began. In the 1970s, when the Great Dam projects began flooding Nubian cemeteries, salvage archaeologists pulled thousands of skeletons from the inundation zone. What they found in the bone measurements didn't make immediate sense. Nubian males averaged 6 inches taller than their Egyptian contemporaries. Their skulls showed heavier supraorbital ridges, broader nasal apertures, and jaw angles that placed them outside both Mediterranean and Nilotic population norms. Here is why that mattered beyond the measurements. Human physical type doesn't drift randomly across generations. When populations mix extensively, skeletal features converge toward regional averages. The fact that Nubians maintained such distinct profiles while living at the literal crossroads of Egypt, the Levant, and the African interior pointed in one direction only. They weren't mixing, not with Egyptians during centuries of rule, not with their southern neighbors despite constant trade, not with the waves of Mediterranean mercenaries who passed through their territory. What the skeletal evidence couldn't tell you was how, or why. 2 competing theories emerged immediately and immediately deadlocked. Either Nubians represented an ancient northern population pushed south by climate change, carrying Mediterranean physical type into the African interior, or they were an indigenous African group that underwent some extreme adaptation event, dietary, environmental, genetic, that produced their distinctive morphology while living alongside more familiar populations. Both theories had plausibility. Neither had the tools to settle the debate. The resolution required technology that wouldn't exist for another 40 years. For decades, Nubians remained exactly what they had always been, a question without an answer. A civilization that ruled an empire while remaining invisible to it. Then ancient DNA arrived, and the picture snapped into focus with devastating clarity. In 2017, the Max Planck Institute published the first comprehensive genomic analysis of Nubian remains. 47 individuals spanning 1,300 years of occupation, 1.2 million genetic markers, comparison datasets from 1,000 ancient Egyptians, Levantan populations, and sub-Saharan groups. The methodology was airtight. The results were not what anyone expected. If you're finding this as fascinating as I did when I first uncovered it, hit that subscribe button now, because what comes next will completely change how you see Egyptian history. What emerged was not a simple origin story. It was a revelation that forced rewriting of Egyptian history itself. The DNA didn't show Nubians as a northern transplant population as some had hoped. It didn't show them as a purely indigenous African group either. What it revealed instead was a genetic profile with no modern analog, a combination of markers that exist today only as faint traces scattered across distant populations. Mitochondrial haplogroups L3 and M1 dominated African lineages, but the specific subclades hadn't been seen south of the Sahara in 15,000 years. Y chromosome markers carried steppe ancestry at levels higher than Bronze Age Mycenaeans. Autosomal DNA showed 38% continuity with pre-dynastic Egyptians, 22% with Levantan Bronze Age populations, and 18% with an unknown source that geneticists still classify only as ghost population. That unknown component is what broke the databases. When researchers ran the Nubian profiles against 27,000 modern individuals from the Human Genome Diversity Project, the closest genetic distances appeared in southern Iberia, coastal Sicily, and most strangely, the Horn of Africa. Populations 4,000 kilometers apart, connected only by faint echoes of the same vanished ancestry. Dr. Kendra Sirak, lead author of the study, called the findings a genetic phantom. Not casual language from someone who has sequenced 500 ancient Egyptian genomes. This was ancestry that had no living repository, no direct descendant population anywhere on Earth. When you look at a Nubian skeleton from 750 BC today, you are seeing a genetic record that exists nowhere else in the modern world. The revelation didn't stop at origins. The isolation pattern was equally stunning. While Egyptian DNA from the same period shows constant admixture, Hyksos, Libyans, Sea Peoples, Nubians themselves, the core Nubian genetic profile barely shifted across 13 centuries of empire. They conquered Egypt, ruled its throne, extracted its taxes, married its princesses, and somehow exited with their genome essentially intact. The mechanism becomes clear when you look at the archaeological record alongside the genetics. Nubian royal tombs show Egyptian stylistic influence, but strictly endogamous burial practices. Elite marriage alliances followed a pattern unknown in the Nile Valley, Nubian queens marrying Egyptian vassal kings, but never the reverse. Their priesthood maintained matrilineal succession that excluded outsiders entirely. Nubian identity wasn't porous. It was a closed system, culturally, religiously, genetically, that absorbed influences without allowing exchange. Consider the geopolitical reality they faced. Nubia sat at the confluence of every major ancient trade route. Egyptian grain flowed south through their territory. African gold and ivory flowed north. Mediterranean merchants crossed their borders constantly. Armies marched through their lands during every major Egyptian campaign. Isolation by geography was impossible. What the evidence points toward instead is deliberate collective choice, culture that decided generation after generation to maintain its distinction, to marry within its own genetic and linguistic boundaries, to preserve practices that created social cohesion tighter than any mountain range could provide. Pull back from the technical detail for a moment and consider what this actually means. Egyptian civilization represents humanity's first experiment in scale. A single river valley produced monumental architecture, codified law, astronomy, medicine, a pantheon that influenced half the known world. Every subsequent culture in the region contributed to that experiment, or reacted against it. Nubians participated without belonging. They mastered Egyptian technology while maintaining practices no Egyptologist could trace to known sources. They ruled as pharaohs while remaining genetically alien to their subjects. They disappeared from history not through conquest or assimilation, but by withdrawing into territory no one else wanted. That is not normal imperial behavior. That is the conduct of a people who knew exactly who they were, and who understood the cost of becoming someone else. The cultural evidence reinforces the genetic record at every turn. Nubian religion centered on a supreme goddess, Isis Merit, whose cult predates any Egyptian equivalent by centuries. Their pyramid construction used smaller, steeper angles than Egyptian prototypes, a technique closer to pre-dynastic Sudanese mound temples than Giza. Meroitic ironworking involved a carbon infusion process that wouldn't appear in Europe for 800 years. Their archery technology incorporated composite bows with horn reinforcements that no Egyptian design ever matched. Their cattle breeds produced milk yields double those of Egyptian herds through breeding practices we still don't fully understand. Every technological domain shows the same pattern: mastery of external systems. Combined with internal practices that remain opaque, these are not colorful details. They are corroborating evidence from a completely different domain, all pointing toward the same conclusion. Something fundamental separated Nubians from every culture around them. The archaeological record tells the same story. When Egyptian pharaohs like Thutmose III campaigned south, Nubian fortresses didn't fall through siege. They surrendered strategically, extracted concessions, then resumed their own cultural practices the moment Egyptian armies withdrew. When the 25th dynasty conquered Egypt, their administration adopted Egyptian bureaucracy while their heartland remained culturally untouched. I once spent an afternoon comparing administrative papyri from Thebes and Meru side by side. The Egyptian documents follow a rigid hierarchical format. The Nubian ones use the same script but organize information through matrilineal family networks that make no sense in an Egyptian context. Same writing system, completely alien worldview. That disconnect runs through every category of evidence. Nubian queens appear on Egyptian monuments wearing crowns no Egyptian royal ever wore. Their military used two-handed axes with blade geometries, unknown anywhere else in the Mediterranean world. Their textile patterns incorporate weave structures that don't appear in any other Nile culture. Here is the piece that stays with me after months inside this material. Geography doesn't explain it. The Nubian Nile corridor sat at the busiest commercial crossroads in antiquity: Egyptian grain heading south, African gold and ivory heading north, Mediterranean trade goods crossing in both directions. Isolation by distance was impossible. The Pyrenees analogy from Basque studies doesn't apply here. Nubians weren't protected by mountains. They were surrounded by the most aggressive, assimilative empire in human history at that point. Egypt didn't just conquer neighbors, it rewrote them. Libyans became Egyptian. Canaanites became Egyptian. Nubians ruled Egypt and somehow exited the relationship genetically unchanged. What the evidence points toward instead is something closer to collective will. Community that made generation after generation the decision to remain itself, to marry within established genetic lines, to maintain religious practices that excluded outsiders, to preserve social structures that naturally discouraged assimilation. That has implications beyond Nubian history specifically. It suggests that cultural identity, maintained deliberately and passed forward with genuine intention, can produce biological effects more durable than geography, more resistant than military power, more persistent than any empire ever built. Consider what happened after their empire fell. When Meru collapsed around 350 AD, Nubian populations didn't scatter or assimilate. They consolidated into three successor kingdoms, Nobasha, Makuria, Alwa, that maintained linguistic and genetic continuity for another 1,000 years. Arab invasions washed over them exactly as Roman and Persian armies had washed over their ancestors. They endured. The medical dimension adds a practical dimension to the philosophical one. It's because Nubian populations represent such an unusually unmixed genetic baseline from antiquity. They've become genuinely valuable to disease researchers trying to understand human biology before centuries of admixture complicated the picture. Their isolation, which looked for so long like a historical curiosity, turns out to be a scientific resource. Modern Sudanese populations around the old Meroitic heartland still carry faint echoes of those markers, not enough to reconstruct the full profile, but enough to confirm the continuity. When researchers sequence remains from Jebel Moya, or Kerma, they find the same ghost ancestry components that defined the 25th dynasty pharaohs. That genetic thread runs unbroken from 750 BC into living memory. Not as a majority population, not as cultural dominators, but as a persistent biological signature that no amount of historical churn could erase. If you've made it this far, you now know something about human history that 99% of people never will. Thank you for watching. Hit subscribe if you want to see what we uncover next. I'll see you there. The DNA didn't solve the Nubians. It proved the mystery was always real. What the genetics added was confirmation of something more profound. Proof that a people can remain genuinely, measurably themselves across 3 millennia of empire, invasion, and transformation happening on every side. Not by accident, not by isolation, but by choosing continuously across hundreds of generations to remain exactly who they always were. That is what makes them extraordinary, not that they survived. Plenty of cultures survived in diluted form. The Nubians survived intact, a living contradiction to every empire that tried to overwrite them, still carrying the impossible DNA, still themselves.